Hi, and welcome to another episode of Around the Neighborhood with me, Scott McMahon. This is a show about the quest for fun, history, and mystery in our backyards. And today we're at the Lone Fir Cemetery here in Southeast Portland. And why we're here? Well, I have some friends from out of state, they're also my clients, that have an affinity for ghost hunting, and they really wanted to see this particular cemetery. I did an episode way back when on our trip to Paris, where I visited the Père Lachaise cemetery, where Jim Morrison is buried and so on. Here we have in our own backyards this amazing cemetery, which is supposed to be like 30 acres, and over 25,000 people are buried here. So let's take a look at this history. So here are some of the things I do know about the Lone Fir Cemetery. It was originally bought as farmland by James Stevens back in 1846. But as his family made a trek out here, his father soon died when they arrived in Oregon. And they set up a little burial site for him here on the land someplace. And then Stevens sold the land to Colburn Barrel in 1854. One of the conditions upon selling the land to Colburn Barrel was that Barrel had to make sure that he preserved the gravesite of his father, of James Stevens' father. Colburn owned a steamboat called the Gazelle, which exploded and went in flames, killing 24 people. So when the awful accident happened and 24 people died on the steamboat, Barrel set aside land on this particular area, eventually became a cemetery. And the reason it's called Lone Fir Cemetery is because the wife of Colburn Barrel, Aurelia, she was the one who said you should call it Lone Fir Cemetery because there was one lone fir tree in this whole farmland that eventually became the cemetery. The mystery is, can we find that one lone fir tree if it even exists still? And hopefully I can find some evidence here and some history here that gives us indication where that one lone fir tree might have been. So we have this monument that was erected in 1902 to honor all the soldiers during the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Indian War, and the Mexican War. The Lone Fir Cemetery Foundation is in works with the Metro, the government here, to restore this particular tomb because it houses two brothers, George Michael and George Frederick Bottler, who were some of the first brewers here in Portland. They came from Germany, they worked in Indiana, they came out to the Pacific Northwest, where they opened the second brewery ever here in Portland in the mid-1800s called City Brewery. As you can see, it's pretty run down. There's like a hole on top of the roof. What I found out online, there's also another organization called the Friends of Lone Fir Cemetery. And it's just a nonprofit volunteer organization that spends time to come out and actually clean the headstones. As you can see, over time, since the pioneer days, it can get pretty dirty and grimy. Over the history of Portland, there's been a lot of politicians and prominent people that built Portland that are buried here. You have several mayors, several authors. So we have a family crypt here, but I can't tell who the family is. The front of the sign is half missing, so it's like a clove or something, and then you can't see quite into the crypt, but there's several bodies buried. I think obviously all belong to the same family. So I'll have to look online who this actually belongs to. All right, here we go. Rain's coming in and out. I'll have to get under cover, put my hood on. Well, the rain has really come down hard, that's why I had to break out the umbrella. But I was able to discover where the lone fir, the original tree that this whole cemetery was named after, and it's right behind me. I just found out who that mausoleum belonged to. You know how it had CLA on the sign, but all of it was broken off? Well, it happens to belong to Donald McClay. He was a Scottish immigrant who built a lot of businesses here in Portland and was very pronounced in the development of Portland. In fact, his legacy lives on in a number of different places. This area represents a historical site for Portland because it houses the burial grounds for over 1,000 Chinese immigrant workers that came here to the Pacific Northwest to help build the railroad and the infrastructure here. As well as over 200 mentally insane patients are buried here at the Oregon Hospital for the Insane, which I didn't know used to exist between Belmont and Hawthorne, as what we know Belmont and Hawthorne today. Back then, I think it was called between 9th and 12th Avenue. So if you're ever in this part of town and you want to look at the Lone Fir Cemetery, you can see this large plot of land. There's a lot of bodies that helped build Portland for what it is today. So here's an example of an old headstone that is being preserved and renovated by the Friends of the Lone Fir Cemetery. This particular person, Valerie Brown, died at the age of 56 back in 1871. Well, this cemetery all started with this particular person here. This is the Stevens family. James Stevens' father, Emmer Stevens, had died just as they arrived to Oregon to claim their land here, which was originally farmland. And so they had him buried in this particular spot. And obviously years later, when James and his wife Elizabeth died, they had them buried here alongside their father. So this is where it all starts, with this particular family and this gravesite that eventually became Lone Fir Cemetery. Since being up here, I see a lot of people just like walking through or doing some jogs through the cemetery. It's very peaceful. It's not very macabre, although there's been a handful of movies that have been filmed here at the Lone Fir Cemetery, and a recent movie called My Summer as a Goth. So check out the links below so you can get a good gauge of what films were shot here. So right behind me is Central Catholic High School, and when they were building this particular school, they had to remove a bunch of buried bodies over in that land to bring them over to the Lone Fir Cemetery. So for a while here, the students that would play on the athletic fields, they would call it the boneyards, because that's where the bodies were originally located. What's really cool is there's some headstones that aren't so, traditionally, macabre as we think of headstones, but they're actually whimsical, like these. As I was saying, I'm here with friends that are really into ghost hunting, and one of them went over to where the burial site where the Chinese railroad workers and some of the insane asylum patients exist, and he thinks he caught something. So what we heard was that he was by himself and he was reading the sign, and right before he got to the word body dump, and very faintly you could probably hear another person saying body dump, but he says that he was by himself, there was no one around him. So did we catch something called the electronic voice phenomenon? Well, let's take a listen.
Are you Chinese? Are you a psych patient? Please talk to me right now. I will free you if I could. This is a body dump.
Body dump. Body dump. Body dump. Body dump.
And speaking of electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, several years ago, while we were attending the Portland Underground walking tours, we were able to go to the basement level of the Old Town Pizza. During that event, we caught some interesting voice recordings that we don't really know where they came from. So if you stay to the very end of this video, I'll share that with you. So right behind me is the gravesite for James Hawthorne, who was the physician for the Oregon Hospital for the Insane. Well, I hope you like this episode, and since the show is sponsored by my real estate services, all my contact information is listed below in case you have any questions about buying or selling a home. Until then, I'll see you around the neighborhood. Well, you can end up in a grave like that, where there's nothing but a tombstone that says, husband. So we made it to Old Town Pizza, which is a fabulous place to visit when you're in Portland, as well as it's part of the underground walking tours or the ghost tours that they have here. And we did one a few years ago, and we ended up in the basement of this area And it's famous because people were getting knocked out and mugged and transported onto these tunnels and then sent on a ship all the way out to Shanghai. Famous Shanghai tunnels. Anyway, the place that I'm sitting in right now happens to be the abandoned elevator shaft. And why it's famous is because when this building was in operations, there was an employee, she was actually a white slave. Her name is spelled Nina, and we might say it's Nina, but it's actually pronounced Nina. And Nina was working here, and something happened where she was pushed down this elevator shaft to her death. So a lot of reports say that she still haunts this area. But since you stayed to the very end of this video, I'm going to share with you the EVP recordings that we got years ago when we did the underground walking tour, again in the basement level below us. You'll hear in the recordings that the tour guide is talking, but everyone else is really just listening to him. So we have no idea where these voices came from. You can make your own opinion of what you hear in these recordings, but when we got home and we processed the data, we got pretty excited. So here you go.
That's when it's really quiet down here. We've got all the lights on. That's when it's really quiet down here. We've got all the lights on. That's when it's really quiet down here. We've got all